Sing, Muse, the spite of Mariana, wife of the young Conrad Seabra, that morning in April 1879. What was the cause of such an uproar? A simple hat. Lightweight, not inelegant, just an ordinary hat. Conrad, a lawyer with an office in the commercial district, wore it every day to the city, and it went with him to hearings. The only place he didn't bring it were receptions, the opera, funerals, and ceremonies. On the whole, it was constantly with him, and remained so for 5 or 6 years, most of which were during his marriage. And so, on that one morning in April, having finished his breakfast, Conrad began to roll a cigarette, and Mariana announced that she was going to ask him something. "What is it, my angel?" "Are you able to give up one thing for me?" 10 things. 20. "Very well. Don't go to the city any more with that hat." "Why? Is it hideous?" "I didn't say it was hideous. It's just that it's for around here, for walking in the neighborhood in the evening or at night. But in the city, for a lawyer, it doesn't seem—"
"How silly, Yaya!"
"Well, perhaps, but do this favor for me. Will you do it?" Conrad struck a match, lit his cigarette, and made a funny gesture to break off the conversation. But his wife doubled down. This stubbornness, at first loose and supple, soon turned imperious and rough. Conrad was amazed. He knew his wife. She was ordinary, a passive creature, gentle, willing to adapt, able to wear with the same divine indifference a royal diadem as easily as a cap. The proof is that, having had a life of constant promenading during her last 2 years of being single, she got married suddenly, as if she were perfectly accustomed to domesticity. She went out occasionally, but mostly with her husband, and yet she was only comfortable at home. Furniture, curtains, and the decor were her only children, and she loved them like a mother. So much was the concord between the homemaker and the habitat that she savored being occupied with the most mundane details of the house, keeping the curtains folded perfectly and so on. One of the 3 windows that faced the street, for example, always stayed half opened and never otherwise. Not even the husband's tiny office escaped the monotonous exigencies of his wife, who kept his books cluttered in exactly the same way until he came to put them back in order. Her mental habits followed the same uniformity. Mariana was disposed to very few ideas and never read, if not the same books, Morenina by Macedo, 7 times, Ivanhoe and Pirate by Walter Scott, 10 times, and The Enigmatic Word by Madame Craven, 11 times. That said, how does this explain the case of the hat? Well, one evening at night, while her husband went to a session of the Institute of the Order of Lawyers, Mariana's father came to their house. He was a nice old fellow, thin, deliberate, an ex-public servant, a nostalgiac for the old days when employees went to their offices in frock coats. This type of coat was what even now he wore to funerals, not for the reason you might expect, the solemnity of death or the gravity of a final farewell, but one less philosophical. It was from the olden days. He never wore anything else, not for funerals, not for dining at 2 o'clock, nor 20 other occasions, and he was so insistent in his habits that even upon every wedding anniversary of his daughter, he showed up at 6 o'clock in the evening, having dined and already digested his supper, and watched them eat. Finally had a little dessert, glass of wine, and then a coffee. Such was Conrad's father-in-law. Now, how do you suppose he felt about his son-in-law's vulgar little hat? He tolerated it in silence, paying attention only to the qualities of the person, nothing more. That day, however, he happened to notice the young man at a glance on the street in conversation among other distinguished hats of gentlemen, and never did his son-in-law seem so ignoble. That night, meeting his daughter alone, he opened his heart to her, and he described the vulgar little hat as an abomination of abominations, and urged her to send it into exile. Now, Conrad was ignorant of this circumstance, that is to say, the origins of her request. Knowing his wife's docile nature, He didn't understand her resistance, and because he was authoritarian and willful, her insistence came to irritate him deeply. Even so, he contained himself. He preferred to mock the situation, and he spoke to her with such irony and disdain that the poor lady felt humiliated. Mariana wanted to get up twice, but he made her stay, the first time taking her lightly by the wrist, and the second time subduing her with his gaze. And then he said, smiling, "Look, yeah, I have a philosophical reason not to do what you asked of me. I've never spoken to you in this way. Always up to now, I've trusted your judgment in everything." Mariana bit her lip without saying anything more. She picked up a knife and began to tap it slowly, just to be doing something. Not even in this did she concede to her husband, who took the knife and continued, "The choice of this hat isn't an indifferent action as you may suppose. It's governed by a metaphysical principle. It's not a matter concerned with the idea that whoever buys a hat exercises a voluntary and free action. The truth is that it obeys an obscure determinism. The illusion of liberty is rooted in the buyers and maintained by the hat sellers who, upon seeing a customer trying on 30 or 40 hats and leaving without buying one, imagine the man shopping freely for an elegant match. The metaphysical principle is this: the hat is integrated with the man, an extension of the head, its complement, decreed ab eterno. No one can change it without committing a mutilation. It's a profound question that hasn't occurred yet to anyone. Wise men have studied everything from the star to the worm, or to cite a bibliographic example, from Laplace to... Oh, you haven't read Laplace. From Laplace and his celestial mechanics to Darwin and his curious book about earthworms. In any case, they still haven't remembered to stop in front of a hat and study it on all sides. No one's ever posited that there is a metaphysics of the hat. Well, maybe I'll write a memoir in this respect, but it's 9:45 now. I don't have time to say anything more. If you reflect, you will understand. Who knows? Maybe the hat isn't even complementary to the man, but the man is complementary to the hat. Mariana finally submitted, and she left the table. She understood nothing of that thorny nomenclature, nor of his strange theory. She felt it was sarcasm, though, and inside she cried with shame. Her husband went upstairs to get dressed. He came back down after a few minutes and stopped in front of her with the celebrated hat upon his head. Mariana found him, in truth, clumsy, ordinary, vulgar, and not one bit serious. Conrad ceremoniously said goodbye and left. The lady's irritation had relaxed to a large degree, but the feeling of humiliation continued. Mariana didn't cry, she didn't sob, as she imagined she would, but inside remembered the simplicity of her request, Conrad's sarcasms, and outside of recognizing that the request was a bit demanding, she found no justification for such excesses. She walked back and forth and couldn't stop. She went into the parlor, arrived at the half-opened window, saw her husband still there in the street, waiting for the trolley, his back to the house with that perennially stupid hat on his head. Mariana felt herself overcome with hatred because of this ridiculous accessory. She couldn't comprehend how she had stood it for so many years. She remembered the years, thinking of how docile she had been by giving in to all the druthers and the whims of her husband, and asked herself if this was not the very cause of his excesses of that morning. She called herself an indecisive fool. If she had only done like so many others, Clara and Sophia, for example, who treated their husbands as they ought to be treated, not half, not a shadow of what took place would have happened to her. Going from one reflection to the next, she came up with the idea to get out. She dressed herself and went to the house of Sophia, an old friend from school, with only a plan to unwind, but not to tell her anything. Sophia was 30 years old, 2 years older than Mariana. She was tall, strong, and more mature. She received her friend with all due ceremony, and even though the latter didn't say anything, Sophia guessed that she brought with her a heartbreak, and a big one. So much for Mariana's plans. She spent 20 minutes spilling everything. Sophia laughed at her and shrugged her shoulders. She told Mariana that her husband was not the one at fault. "I know it's my fault," agreed Mariana. "Don't be a fool, Yaya. You've been too soft with him. Be strong for once. Ignore this. Don't speak too soon. And if he comes to make up, tell him that he must first change his hat. Look, it's nothing. In the end, he's as right as he can be, as much as anyone else is. Now look at this fool, Beatrice. Hasn't she gone away to the country only because her husband has suspicions about an Englishman who rides by on his horse in the evenings? Poor Englishman. Naturally, he doesn't notice at all her absence. See, one can live happily with one's husband in mutual respect without going against each other's wishes, without malice or cruelty. Look, I live here very well with Richard in harmony. I ask nothing of him that he won't do right away, and even when he doesn't feel like it whatsoever, it is enough that I darken my expression, and he obeys me immediately. He was never so stubborn because of his hat. Can you imagine? I should say not. Where would it end? He'd change his hat whether he wanted to or not. Mariana listened with envy to this beautiful definition of conjugal bliss. It came as an invocation of trumpets straight from the disobedience from Eve, and the contact with her friend gave her an itch for independence and free will. To complete the picture, this Sophia was the mistress not only of herself, but also of others. She had eyes for all Englishmen, whether on horseback or on foot. She was honest, but a tease. A crude term, perhaps, but there's no time to come up here with one more genteel. She flirted left and right out of natural necessity as if she were single, and yet it was only love's small change that she handed out to the poor fellows knocking on her door. A nickel to one, another to the next, but never a note of 5,000 hace, much less a contractual stipend. And it was this same sentiment of charity that led her to propose to her friend that they take a stroll, to see the shops, to contemplate the sight of other hats, more beautiful and serious. Mariana accepted. A certain demon breathed into her the furies of vengeance. Moreover, her friend had the power to fascinate, the power of Bonaparte, and didn't give her time to think it over. Yes, I would like to. I was tired of being captive. I, too, wanted a little pleasure, etc., etc. While Sophia went to get dressed, Mariana remained in the parlor, giddy and self-satisfied. She planned out her life for the whole week, planning the days and the hours for everything like a state visit. She stood up, she sat down, she walked to the window waiting for her friend. "Sophia seems to have died," she muttered from time to time. Once of the many times she went to the window, she saw a young man passing by on a horse. He was not English. But she thought back to the woman whose husband took her away to the country, mistrusting that Englishman, and she felt a growing hatred for the masculine race, with the exception, perhaps, of young men on horses. Actually, this one was too affected. His leg extended to the stirrup with an obvious vanity apparent in his boots, and he propped his hand on his waist with the air of a dandy. Mariana noted these two defects, but found that his hat redeemed them. Not that it was an elegant hat. It was common, but still appropriate to an equestrian. It was not covering the head of a lawyer going with gravitas toward his office, but a man at leisure, or just killing time. The heels of Sophia's shoes tapped out a rhythm on the staircase. "Ready," she said, just after she entered the room. She really was beautiful. We already know she was tall. Her hat added an air of aristocracy, and a devilish black silk dress rounding out her bust made her even more dazzling. At her feet, the figure of Mariana disappeared just a little bit. One had to see her first to notice that she had graceful features, beautiful eyes, and considerable natural elegance. The problem was that her counterpart dominated instantly. And when there was no time to really look, Sophia took all the attention for herself. And this observation would be incomplete if I didn't add that Sophia was aware of her superiority, and because of this she appreciated the beauties of Mariana's type, less overflowing and abundant than her own. Now, if this is a defect, it's not up to me to mend it. "Where are we going?" Mariana asked. "Silly, we're going to stroll around the city. I remember now, I'm going to get a portrait taken and then go to the dentist. No, we go first to the dentist. You don't need to go to the dentist? No? You don't want your picture taken? Why, I have many already. And what for? To present to the lord of the manor?" Sophia saw that the resentment of her friend persisted, and during the walk added a pinch of salt to the wound. She told her that even though it's difficult, there was still time to free herself, and she taught her a method to escape tyranny. It wasn't suitable to go right away all at once, but slowly, surely, in such a way that he would find out for himself when she had her foot on his throat. A 3 or 4 week job, no more. Sophia herself was ready to help her and repeated to her that she was not to be soft and that she was the slave of no one, etc. Mariana was singing in her heart, La Marseillaise of matrimony. When they arrived at Overdore Street, it was a little past midday. There were lots of people walking and standing around, the customary ebb and flow. Mariana felt a little shaken, as always happened to her. Uniformity and placidity, which were the foundation of her character and her life, received from all that agitation the usual aversions. She could barely walk between groups, and still less did she know where to fix her eyes. Such was the confusion of people, such was the variety of stores. She held very close to her friend, and without noticing, they passed the dentist's house. She was anxious to get inside. It would be a brief repose, but better than the tumult. "Oh, this Overdore Street," she was just saying when, "Hello," responded Sophia, turning her head toward her and her eyes toward a young man who was on the opposite sidewalk. Sophia, practiced in these seas, slipped past, cut through, and skirted around people with great skill and aplomb. She was an imposing figure. Those who knew her enjoyed seeing her again, and those who didn't know her stopped or turned to admire her elegance. And the great benefactress, full of charity, showered her gaze right and left without much scandal because Mariana served to coordinate her movements. She said nothing as she moved through. It seemed she didn't even hear the responses of her friend. And then she spoke of everything, of other women who came or went, of a shop, of a hat with precision about hats, whether a lady's or a man's. And these abounded in the early afternoon in Overdore Street. "Look at this," Sophia said to her, and Mariana obliged by looking. Hats both feminine and masculine, without knowing where to fix her gaze because the restless spirits of the hats kept coming one after another as within a kaleidoscope. "Where was the dentist?" she asked her friend. It was only after repeating this a second time that Sophia replied that they had passed the house and that they were already getting to the end of the street, and after that they would turn around. They at last arrived. "Ugh," puffed Mariana, entering the vestibule. "What is it? My God, you look at you. It looks like you're in the country." The dentist's waiting room already had some patients inside. Mariana found not one familiar face among them, and so to escape the gaze of strangers, she went to the window. From the front window, she could enjoy the street without getting run over. She leaned back. Sophia came over. Some masculine hats standing around began staring at them. Others passing by did the same thing. Mariana was annoyed by their persistence, but noticed that they stared mostly at her friend. Her tedium dissolved into a kind of envy. Sophia, meanwhile, told her stories of some of the hats, more correctly, their adventures. One of them had earned the thoughts of Jane. Another one went around melting for Jill, just as she did for him, so much so that those two were in Overdore Street without fail every Wednesday and Saturday between 2 and 3 o'clock. Mariana listened to her, stunned. Indeed, the man's hat was beautiful, with a lovely tie on it, possessing an air somewhere between elegance and ostentation. "But I don't swear to it, you understand," her friend said. "But it's what everyone says." Mariana stared thoughtfully at the hat accused. There came now 3 more hats of equal mien and grace, and the 4 together were probably talking about them, and favorably. Mariana blushed all over, turned her head the other way, then soon returned to her previous attitude and finally went inside. Entering, she saw in the room 2 recently arrived ladies and with them a young man who immediately got up and came over to meet her with considerable ceremony. It was her first boyfriend. This first boyfriend by now must have been 33. He had gone abroad to the countryside, to Europe, and had ended up the governor of a southern province. He was medium height, pale, finely bearded, and in a tight-fitting suit. He had in his hand a new top hat, black, serious, gubernatorial, administrative, a hat suited to the person and his ambitions. Mariana could barely even see him. She became extremely confused, extremely disoriented in the presence of a man whom she had known under special circumstances and whom she had not seen since 1877. She recognized nothing about him. She extended out her fingers and even seemed to say something mundane. She started moving back to the window when her friend started toward her. Sophia also knew the recent comer. They exchanged a few words. Mariana, impatient, asked her softly if it wasn't better to put off dental work for another day, but her friend told her no. It would only be a half hour or 45 minutes. Mariana felt oppressed. The presence of such a man tied her senses in knots, thrust her into struggle and confusion. Everything was her husband's fault. If he had not persisted in teasing her, and even more than that, none of this would have happened. And thinking in this way, Mariana swore to take revenge. She thought in her mind's eye of home, so quiet, so cute, where she could be now, as she was accustomed, without the jostling of the street, without being dependent on her friend. "Mariana," the other said to her, "Professor Visozu here insists that he is very thin. Do you find that he's fatter than he was last year? Don't you remember him last year?" Professor Visozu, her old boyfriend, was now in conversation with Sophia, looking many times at Mariana, who responded in the negative. He took advantage of this fissure in the conversation to pull her into it. He said that he hadn't actually seen her in some years, and he underlined what he said with a certain look, both sad and profound. He then whipped open his handy box of topics and pulled out the opera. What did she think of the company? In his opinion, it was excellent, minus the baritone. The baritone seemed tiresome to him. Sophia protested that he thought the baritone was tiresome, but he continued, adding that in London, where he'd heard him for the first time, he seemed the same way. And the ladies, yes, madam, the soprano as much as the contralto were both first-rate, and he spoke of the opera's cited passages, praised the orchestra, mostly of Les Huguenots. He had noticed Mariana on closing night in the 4th or 5th box on the right. "Isn't that correct?" "We were," she murmured, accentuating the plural. "It's in the casino that I haven't seen her." "Oh, you're becoming an exotic species," added Sophia, laughing. Visozu enjoyed the last grand ball very much and unspooled his recollections of it. Sophia did the same with hers. The best costumes were described by both of them in great detail. Next were the people, the characters, 2 or 3 malicious jabs, but so anodyne they did no harm to anyone. Mariana listened to them without interest. 2 or 3 times she had to get up and go to the window, but the hats were so many, and they stimulated so much bewilderment that she returned to sit. Inwardly, she called her friend some ugly names. I don't relate them here because they're not necessary. And indeed, it would be bad taste to reveal what a young lady could think of her friend during a few moments of irritation. "And the races of the Jockey Club?" inquired the former governor. Mariana continued to shake her head. She hadn't been to the races that year. Well, it seems she missed out. At the penultimate principally, she found it extremely exciting, and the horses were first-rate. Those at Epsom, which he had seen when he was in England, were no better than those at the penultimate at the Prado Fluminense. And Sophia said that, yes, truly, the penultimate race did honor to the Jockey Club. She confessed that she liked it very much and had been overcome with emotion. The conversation veered into 2 concerts of that week. Then it boarded a ship, climbed a mountain, and went to Petropolis, where 2 diplomats assumed the expenses of their stay, and they spoke of the wife of a minister of the government. Sophia remembered to be nice to the ex-governor, declaring to him that he needed to get married too because he would soon again be in government. Vesozou shuddered with pleasure and protested no. Then with his eyes on Mariana said that he would probably never marry. Mariana blushed and stood up. "Why, you're in a hurry," Sophia said to her. "What's the time?" she continued, turning back to Vesozou. "Almost 3, he exclaimed. It was late. He had to go to the Chamber of Deputies. He went to speak to the 2 ladies whom he had accompanied in, his cousins, in fact, and he said goodbye to them. He came back to say goodbye to the other ladies, but Sophia said that she would exit with him. She couldn't stay any longer. The truth was, the idea to go to the Chamber of Deputies began to sparkle in her head. "Shall we go to the chamber?" she proposed to her friend. No, Mariana said. "I can't. I'm really tired. Let's go just for a little bit. You think I'm not tired?" Mariana held her ground a little longer, but to insist against Sophia, the dove arguing with the hawk, was really senseless. There was no remedy, and so she went. The street was now more agitated, and the people came and went by both sidewalks, and things got complicated at the intersections. Moreover, the obsequious former governor flanked the 2 ladies and offered to arrange for them a place in the assembly. Mariana's soul felt more and more torn apart by all this confusion of things. She had lost interest since the first hour, and the spitefulness that had given her the force for such an audacious and sudden flight began either to loosen its wings or to detach them entirely. And again she thought of home, so quiet, everything in its place, methodical, all living in mutual respect, everything done without bustle, and foremost, without unexpected change. Her soul tapped her foot in anger. She listened to nothing of what Vesozou was saying, even though he was speaking loudly, and many things were said directly to her. She listened to nothing and wanted to hear nothing. She only prayed to God that the time would pass quickly. They arrived at the chamber and went to the gallery. The rustle of their skirts drew the attention of some 20 deputies who remained, hearing a budget discussion. As soon as Vesozou excused himself and left, Mariana quickly said to her friend not to make her do anything more. "Anything more? No more scenes like this, to go from one place to some other crazy activity. What have I got to do with the chamber to listen to discussions I don't even understand?" Sophia smiled, fluttered her fan, and caught full on the gaze of one of the deputies. There were many eyes that stared at her when she went into the chamber, but those of this deputy had an extra special expression, warm and appealing. One can understand, then, her not accepting his attention immediately. One can even understand her curious gaze. While she welcomed this legislator's leer, she admitted to her friend tenderly that the fault was her own, but her intentions were good, that is, to put her friend back in touch with herself. "But if you find that I bore you, don't come with me any more," concluded Sophia, then leaning in a little. "Oh, look, the Minister of Justice." Mariana had no remedy but to look at the Minister of Justice. His speech was that of an orator, a statesman who made a case for the conventions of the correctional courts, which incidentally comprised the old colonial laws. There was not even an interjection spoken. It was a resigned silence, polite, discreet, and cautious. Mariana's eyes passed from one side to the other without interest. Sophia said many things to her just to be able to make a display of graceful gestures. At the end of 15 minutes, there was an outburst in the chamber. Thanks to an assertion made by the orator and a response from the opposition, they heckled each other, and the opposition was more courageous than the majority, and there followed a tumult that lasted close to a quarter of an hour. This was not Mariana's idea of fun. Her uniform and calm spirit was overwhelmed in the middle of so much, and by all the unexpected agitation, she eventually got up to leave, but she sat down again. By now she was disposed to stay to the end, regretful and resolved to cry only to herself about her marital woes. The question really began to burrow into her. She was right to question her husband. But was it really such a case of injury? Was all this ado reasonable? Certainly, his sarcasm was cruel, but all things considered, it was the first time she had put her foot down. and naturally the revelation irritated him. In any case, it had been a mistake to reveal everything to her friend. Sophia might go and tell others. This idea gave Mariana a chill. The indiscretion of her friend was certain. She had heard quite a few stories of masculine and feminine hats, even more serious than a simple row. Mariana felt the necessity to flatter her friend and cover her own impatience and anger with a mask of hypocritical docility. She started to smile as well, to make some observations in respect to one or other of the deputies, and in this way they got to the end of the session's discourse. It was 4:00. "Time to gather themselves," Sophia said, and Mariana agreed, yet with no impatience, and both turned to take Overdore Street. Once on the street, their catching the trolley put an end to Mariana's spirit of fatigue, and she could finally breathe when she saw she was going home. Just before her friend got off, she asked her to keep secret what she had said. Sophia promised she would. Mariana breathed a sigh of relief. The dove was free of the hawk. She carried inside her a soul sick from the encounters, dizzy from the variety of people and things. She needed to regain her balance. She was close to home. As she saw the other houses and nearby farms, Mariana felt restored to herself. She finally arrived. She entered the garden and took a deep breath. This was her world. Rather, minus one pot, which the gardener had moved. "João, put this pot back where it was before," she said. All the rest was in order. The entry hall, the parlor, the dining room, the bedrooms, everything. Before anything else, Mariana sat in different places, looking carefully at everything, so quiet and ordered. After an entire morning of perturbation and variety, the monotony brought her great peace, and never did it seem so delicious. In fact, she felt bad. She wanted to recount all her day's accomplishments, but she couldn't. Her soul was absorbed by everything in all its homely uniformity. At the most, she considered the figure of Visozu, who she now found ridiculous, albeit an unjust assessment. She undressed slowly, lovingly stowing each object. Once undressed, she thought again about the row with her husband. She thought how heavy things became, and the main fault was hers. What a stubborn devil she was. All because of a hat that her husband had already worn for such a long time. Also, her father was too demanding. "I will see the man at face value," she thought. It was 5:30. He wouldn't be long now. Mariana was in the front room looking out the window, listening carefully for the trolley. And nothing. She sat there with Ivanhoe opened upon her palms, wanting to read but reading nothing. Her eyes slipped to the bottom of the page, and then they went back to the top to start again, first because she missed the sense, and second because now and again they strayed from the page to savor the folds of the curtains or some other particular feature of the room. Blessed monotony, sitting in the lap of eternity. Finally the trolley stopped, and her husband got off. The iron gate to the garden creaked. Mariana went to the window to look out. Conrad entered slowly, looking right and left with his hat on his head. Not the infamous hat of his custom, but a different one requested by his wife that morning. Mariana's spirit received a violent shock, equal to the shock that the misplaced vase in the garden gave her, or what a page of Voltaire would give within the leaves of Ivanhoe or Moranina. It was a note out of place in the melody of life's harmonious sonata. No, not this hat. Truly, what insanity made her demand that he toss out the other one that suited him so well? And so what if it was not very much like him? It had been with him a long time. It was what completed her husband's face. Conrad entered through a side door. Mariana took him in her arms. "So, has it passed?" he finally asked, encircling his arms about her waist. "Listen," she answered with a divine caress. "Throw this out." I prefer you as you were.
Chapter of the Hats by Machado de Assis. First published in 1884. Translated from Portuguese for audio performance by Todd Connor. Copyright 2020. Featuring a new interpretation of Chiquinho Gonzaga's 1896 composition of Saudade, commissioned for this podcast and generously donated by the artist, who remains anonymous, retaining all rights, copyright 2020. This telling of Chapter of the Hats was recorded in front of a live audience at the Players Club in New York City.
If you like this work and would like to support the Carryorker, please consider making a purchase at the Carryorker Podcast Store. A direct link is available on the website at www.thecarryorker.com. Or if you'd like to make a donation, click on the website's link for PayPal. Commercial or private sponsorship of future episodes can include the recording of a story live at your own location. See the website for details. In the meantime, as always, listen, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.